Welcome to Straight from the Gavel. I'm your host, Dave Barber, coming to you today from inside the House Lounge here at the Rhode Island State Capitol. In these segments, we like to visit with members of the General Assembly and discuss some of the things they've been working on and its impact on you, the Rhode Island citizen. It gives me a great deal of pleasure to welcome back a woman who's appeared with us before. It is indeed a pleasure to have her back, Chairwoman Edith Ajello. Representative Ajello, good to see you.
Good to see you, Dave. Thank you.
It seems to me, if my memory serves me correctly, it was a year ago this past summer, you joined us, and I remember at that time you were knee-deep in education funding formula stuff. And now, looking back, that the educational funding formula has been enacted, the General Assembly has fully funded it in this most recent budget. A, you have to be pleased, and B, let's look back and give us your retrospective on all of that legislation.
It's good to talk about that issue. In some ways, it seems a year ago when the General Assembly passed the funding formula legislation, seems quite a ways away, but we did work on it for quite a while. Senator Hannah Gallo and I co-chaired a committee looking at funding formula issues around the country and looking at what Rhode Island should do. We made recommendations that were put into legislation, and then in the 2010 legislative session, we had some help from new Education Commissioner Deborah Gist proposing a slightly different formula, and finally it seemed as if the stars are aligned and we got a formula, so that right now what's happening is the funding for education is distributed based on our best estimates of student need and tax capacity in the various school districts.
Well, I'll tell you what, and the Speaker Fox, gives you a great deal of credit for heading up that very, very big task of working through the educational funding formula. And Commissioner Gist has told me that the fact that Rhode Island finally got it done, that was a key ingredient too to the race to the top money that the state of Rhode Island received, some $75 million.
I think that certainly Commissioner Gist and the prospect of the possibility of that race to the top money really helped in getting the General Assembly and the governor on board towards a formula. Towards adopting a formula. What was difficult for Rhode Island was that we did this in a time when there was no new money to add for education funding. That being the case, if you're going to give some districts more money because you feel that their students have greater need and they have lower tax capacity, you have to take that money from another school district. That was the really hard part, and Rhode Island really should be congratulated for having done that, because to my knowledge, no other state has adopted a funding formula legislatively as opposed to by judicial order. No other state has adopted a funding formula without adding new money so that no district would lose money. Mm-hmm. That's the real intensely important and very difficult thing to have done.
We're
doing it.
You're also coming off your first full session as chairwoman of the House Judiciary Committee. It's a very important committee, and I often talk about the amount of hours that House Finance puts in. House Judiciary is either right there, just slightly behind it. Again, it's a big, big task, an enormous amount of meetings and review of all sorts of interesting legislation. What was that experience like for you?
It was exhausting, fascinating, challenging, very much a learning process, and I have a number of people that I have to thank for getting the job done in the past legislative session, and I don't want to go any further without doing that. Mike Marcello, the vice chair of the committee, was phenomenally helpful, involved. Chris Blazejewski, a brand new representative from neighboring district to me, John Breen, Michael Chippendale, Doreen Costa, John DeSimone, Robert Flaherty, Don Lally, Charlene Lima, Peter Martin, Richard Morrison, Patty O'Neill, and Mike Taro. We had a committee of really hard-working people, and it was sometimes a little daunting. Robert Flaherty and Don Lally are both former chairs of the committee. They were very helpful. Everyone was very helpful. The committee attorneys, Paul Jones, John Manny, and Orlando Andrioni, were really helpful. And Roberta de Meza, the clerk for the committee, is just beyond peer. She thinks of what one will need before one needs it. Really have to give a good plug for that staff, Paul Jones, John Manny, Orlando Andrioni, and Roberta de Meza. They are just super people and great staff to have here in the State House.
Well, you mentioned that committee. Some people that serve with you on that committee are also officers of the court, members of the bar, practicing attorneys. You're not a lawyer.
That's true.
And there's no rule that says you have to be a lawyer to be the chair of that committee. Challenges or opportunities? Does that give you a particular challenge because you don't have a law license? Or does it allow you to maybe be a little more objective relative to the legislation that comes before you?
I'm not sure I'd use the word objective. I think that I am able to approach things in a more open and questioning way because I don't have experience in any of the legal areas that we deal with as a practicing attorney. I don't know the routine. I'm not intimately familiar with that section of law. Therefore, when somebody is suggesting a change, I'm really looking at, as most people in the state of Rhode Island are, how is this going to change my life, or how is this going to change somebody else's life? What does this mean? I think, not being a lawyer, I can ask kind of more basic questions, and sometimes actually almost seem like the emperor's wearing no clothes is way too extreme an example. But I think sometimes, not being an attorney, I'm freer to ask a question. What does this mean? Why would we do this? That someone else maybe feels like they should know, and so they're not going to ask the question. I read. I like to read. I spent a lot of time, particularly Sunday afternoons and some evenings here at the State House in the office, reading the law surrounding particular bills so that I had some background, and then sometimes preparing questions for the staff attorneys or for leadership or for members of the committee on what does this mean, how does this work. But I really think maybe I can bring sort of a fresh look at things, not being a lawyer. I don't think in the end it really was a detriment.
You know, it's maybe a little prejudiced on my part, but I happen to think you have the most interesting committee. One of the nicest compliments ever given to me, because I'm not a lawyer either, but I was interviewing Melvin Belli one time, the king of torts, and he referred to me as an osteopathic attorney, and I took that as a great compliment because I'm interested in the law. And we, of course, at Capital TV cover a lot of the Judiciary Committee meetings, and it's always fascinating. Tell our viewers, in your opinion, what were a couple of the more interesting bills that came before you this last legislative session? What are a couple that stick out in your mind and that you found personally fascinating to deal with?
Well, for one, we dealt with and passed, and it became law, legislation increasing the penalties for illegal catching of striped bass, for catching more than the limit. that came to the Judiciary Committee, perhaps because of the fines and penalties, and it turned out that sometime in the past, when hunting and fishing penalties were enacted, the striped bass penalty for catching more than the limit or smaller than the limit in terms of the size of the individual bass, somehow that was not penalized as much as some other hunting or fishing penalties would be, catching lobster or something out of season or whatever. And this legislation was brought before us by the sport fishermen. And we learned a lot about striped bass, about how big an economic issue sport fishing, and particularly striped bass, is for the state of Rhode Island, how valuable one striped bass can be, and close to $100 to sell one. So a penalty of $100 for catching 2 or more adds up to a pretty good risk to take for somebody who is poaching or pirating striped bass. So we passed legislation raising the penalty for catching more than the legal limit, and that will serve to protect our striped bass fisheries, which are, we were told, I believe, a $4 million industry in terms of sport fishing and fishing for food.
Well, and not only that, but you want to control the population. You use the word poaching. That's essentially what it is. I mean, people that have disregard for that, for their own selfish needs, they ought to be punished. And again, there's this whole ecosystem that is something that needs to be protected. And as you mentioned too, tourism and sport fishing in our state is big business.
Yes.
So it's important that...
We're the ocean state.
Exactly. You know, the marriage equality issue too was probably another issue that was clearly one of the most hotly debated topics to come before your committee. Give me your thoughts regarding that issue.
Well, as you know, Dave, I've been a strong supporter of marriage equality, of allowing in Rhode Island same-gender couples to marry just as heterosexual couples can. I was privileged to serve on the Judiciary Committee over a number of years as we heard this legislation, and this year privileged to chair the committee as we had a hearing that went into the early morning hours, listening to the pros and cons. And this year, I think more than ever, the contrast between those testifying against the legislation and those testifying for it crystallized to me how much this really is a separation of church and state issue. Nearly everyone, that if not everyone, who testified against marriage equality used their religion and specific citings in their religious books, the Bible mostly, and everything was about that special relationship between a man and a woman that they saw as represented in their religious teachings. In contrast, there were a number of religious people from Protestant religions, Jewish religions, speaking in favor of marriage equality, not so much citing specific parts of the Bible or their religious book, but speaking about their idea of God and what God would want. And some of that was very moving to me, but it really crystallized in my mind how this issue is so bound up with people's ideas of their religion that we really need to have civil marriage and marriage equality, and let each church do what it would.
You know, Chairwoman, I know you feel the same way. In this country that was based on religious freedom, I, as I'm sure you do, respect people's religious beliefs, whatever they are. But whether you're reading the Talmud, the Quran, the King James Version of the Bible, that's great. The fact of the matter is, there will be a day when Rhode Island and the country as a whole will recognize gay couples with the same rights afforded heterosexual couples. I'm just wondering what's taking so long, because if you take religion out of it and allow each person to worship the way they choose and in the house of worship that they choose, it really is a civil rights issue. And I just don't understand what's taken us so long. I don't mean us, Rhode Island specifically, but there are a lot of states right now that are slow in recognizing rights for gay couples. And we kind of sort of took a baby step this past session. But, I thought that this was a free-thinking, independent-thinking state.
I agree. And I think it is a free-thinking, independent sort of a state. I think many times I and my colleagues mistake loud, angry, public utterances for representing a majority or even a strong minority. I think polls have shown that the public agrees with you and I that marriage equality is, kind of a no-brainer. How's it going to affect me? But I can see someone, I have a friend, I have a relative, that this would clearly benefit. Mm-hmm. That's what the public thinks. Mm-hmm. But there is a small, very vocal minority. And I think too often I and my colleagues pay too much attention to that. We'll get there. We'll get there.
I know too, I hope so. And I hope it's sooner than later, but that's just a personal opinion. I know too, you've been a champion for a number of years for public-funded elections. Mm-hmm. What's going on with that now? Will you be revisiting that again this coming session?
There's a commission that will be working, a joint House-Senate committee to look at public funding of elections. The legislation that I've sponsored in the past, never passed, would provide public funding for candidates for the General Assembly, for candidates for House of Representatives in the Senate here in Rhode Island. Right now we have public funding, matching funding for candidates for statewide office, the governor, the lieutenant governor, treasurer, secretary of state. That aspect has to be looked at now because of the federal Citizens United decision around matching funds and funds from corporations. So we have to look at now our state law regarding matching funds for statewide office candidates and how that has to be modified to work with the Citizens United decision. And the other thing that I hope we can look at as part of this commission is a day in the future when we can have matching or public funding for candidates for House and Representative. A couple of states have it now, Maine, Connecticut, Arizona, I believe.